Everybody, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. My name is Andy Chamberlain. I'm going to try and turn on my webcam. Hopefully you'll be able to see me in a moment. And then I have to, minimize this screen so I can get out of the way. So good afternoon. This afternoon we're going to be talking about tax reform. The reason why we're talking about this is because, as many IPSE members will know, there is a big problem in the tax system, and it's called IR35. Actually, IR35 is a sort of a symptom of a problem in the tax system. And it seems very likely that we're going to need to think about wider tax reform if we ever want to get rid of this thing called IR35, and we really do. Now, I'm joined today by my colleague, Ryan. Are you there, Ryan?
Hi, Andy and everyone else. Yep, I'm here.
Hi. So Ryan's going to join us at the end of the webinar to help me deal with the questions, because we've got quite a lot of people signed up today. So I really want everyone to comment on this, because there's a few ideas in here that we're going to put to you that I'd really like to know your thoughts on, or whether you have any other thoughts or ideas around taxation of self-employment. And when I say self-employment, I mean in the broadest sense of the word. It includes people, it means anyone who's working for themselves, whether they're incorporated, so they have a limited company, as many IPSE members do, and of course that's the population that's affected by IR35, but also sole traders as well, and they have their own problems with the tax system, namely that the Chancellor keeps on trying to, well, successive Chancellors keep on talking about putting up their tax. So we've been having a bit of a think about these things. So yeah, do send in your questions, and also if you could just let me know that you can see and hear us okay, that would be very reassuring to know. I did have some internet problems this morning, but everything seems fine now, so hopefully we'll be okay as we go through this. Okay, so we're going to be looking at some of the demographic changes quickly which have taken place in the labour market over recent years, and why this has forced politicians to come back and look at tax policy in this area. We're also going to mention the three-person problem. This is the phrase which is increasingly used by policymakers, the three-person problem. And the three people they're talking about are employees, sole traders, and directors of limited companies, and how, to their minds, the differences in the tax that they pay is too great. Then we're going to look at employers' NI. And this is really what IR35 is all about. And also it makes life a bit difficult for meaningful, sensible conversations around tax reform. And I think a lot of people overlook this problem of employers in the way that works. And then we're going to put forward a couple of ideas. One of them is the engagers tax, and one of them is the Freelancer Limited Company. But maybe you've got some ideas. Maybe some people out there have some thoughts on this, and you've got some ideas that I'd really love to hear. So do please use the questions box to let us know what you think about all of this stuff. Okay, so this is a quote from John Whiting. John Whiting was the tax director of the Office of Tax Simplification when it was first formed. So from about 2010 until about 2015, memory serves me right. And one of the very first things they looked at was a review of small business taxation, including IR35. The coalition government, which had formed in 2010, set up the OTS, and that was one of they put it in the coalition agreement that this was one of the things that they wanted the OTS to look at first. So I think they did one review on tax reliefs, and then they looked at this issue. And so this was very much in Mr. Whiting's mind throughout his time at the OTS. And this is a quote from him where, as you can see, he says, look, we can't solve IR35 until we solve the whole tax system. And I've increasingly come round to the view that he's probably right about this. IPSE, as many of you all know, believes that IR35 should be scrapped, that it should never have been created in the first place. But that is increasingly looking unlikely that it will simply be scrapped and not replaced with something else. And perhaps the answer lies in looking at why does IR35 exist? Why do policymakers feel that IR35 has to exist? And if we can address some of the problems that we see there, then we won't need IR35 at all. Now, this graph that you can see in front of you here is from the Office of Budget Responsibility, and this came out in 2016. And what they're talking about here is the number of companies that are being incorporated. And I hope that you can see this sort of clear enough, but as you can see, the chart starts in the year 2000, and there was a fairly steady number of incorporations, but they were starting to rise. And then in around about 2008, 2009, they really started to take off. Now, the blue line that you can see at the top, that's the total number of incorporations. And the other color lines are split up into the number of directors in each incorporation, in each company, basically. And the yellow one has just one director. So as you can see, the sort of acceleration that we saw in the number of companies from the year around about 2008, which was around the financial crash, of course, it's gone up, and it's been really powered by one person companies, one director. That's what's going up. And this got the OBR and the then Chancellor Philip Hammond very concerned about one-person companies, or personal service companies, or PSCs, as they're sometimes referred to by the government. It's not a term that IPSE likes, actually, because there's no such thing as a personal service company in law. It's just a limited company. It's the same as any other limited company. But it's used as a term to mean like a contractor type arrangement. So a person working through their own company for a series of clients, that's been used to mean a personal service company. And so they're saying that essentially what the government was saying is, we are concerned by the number of personal service companies, and we are concerned that the number of these companies is going to continue to grow. And the reason why they're concerned about that is because they say that it will effectively, what that means is that this is going to cost the Exchequer 3.5 billion by the year 2021 and 22. Now, bearing in mind this was a bit old. This is now going back to 2016, 2017, when they were making this projection. But nevertheless, you can sort of see here what they're talking about. So the graph in front of you with the coloured lines again, you can see the green one. Because you've got more incorporations, you've got more corporation tax. So that's actually going up. They're saying that we're going to get more money out of corporation tax. The red one is income tax and national insurance. And they're saying if we do nothing, that's going to go down all the way down to where you can see it there at 6.3 billion. So the blue one is they're saying, well, if we do something about this, then we might be able to halt this rise or this lack of tax being given to us. The little chart on the left, by the way, it does the maths where it shows you that essentially what they're working out is, yes, corporation tax goes up. So if you go along to the year 2021-22, you can see corporation tax is up by 2.8 billion, I would imagine. Yeah, billion it is. But income tax and NICs are both down. And by the time you do the maths on all this, you get minus 3.5 billion, which I've highlighted there in the yellow. So this is the problem that the Exchequer faces. They are losing money because lots of people are incorporating companies and working through those companies rather than working as they used to do, probably most of them, in employment. And the Exchequer is saying, we must do something about this because this is causing all sorts of difficulties. Now, it won't surprise you to know that it was these reports from the OBR and these graphs that were used by the Chancellor to bring in the changes to the way IR35 works in the public sector. This is where we saw that first change where they said, look, basically, we need to ensure that we want more people on the payroll. If we get more people on the payroll, we get more money in the bank. That's essentially how it works from the taxman's point of view. So they brought in the IR35 changes because they said we believe there's lots of non-compliance going on. So we're going to change the way that IR35 works to make that non-compliance harder for people to get away with. Now, I'm not going to go into this too much here today, but the real problem is that what they've done, the change that they made in the public sector in 2017, and the change that they are looking to bring in from April in the private sector next year is going to force actually people onto the payroll when they have no business being on a payroll, because they are genuinely in business on their own account. IR35 does not apply to their engagements, but because of the way they've changed the rules, there's going to be over compliance. So the government believed, and I'm not sure they ever really justified this belief, that there was lots of under compliance before. Now they've moved to a model that's going to generate over compliance. Lots of people forced onto payrolls when they shouldn't really be there. This is a problem. This is what IPSE is very, very concerned about, has been concerned about for a very, very long time. But if we're going to convince the policymakers of why they're wrong about this, we need to come up with a different way to tackle the trends that the OBR have raised here. Falling tax receipts as a result of more people forming companies. So let's have a look at why it is that people who work for themselves might be deemed to pay less tax, and break that down a bit and see how it really works. So this graph that you see in front of you here, this is the 3-person problem, and this is a graph from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, by the way. And the Institute of Fiscal Studies are one of the most vociferous arguers that self-employed people and owner-managers, as they call them, company directors basically, should pay more tax. They believe it entirely, and they use graphs such as this one to demonstrate why it is that they should be paying more tax. So here you can see, I hope you can clearly see that on the left column you have an employee, and in the middle you have self-employed, by which they mean sole trader. And in the right column, you have owner manager, by which they mean limited company director. And the different colored boxes represent different chunks of tax. So the owner manager there, the company director, the black chunk, that's corporation tax. The other two don't pay corporation tax. The interesting thing about this is essentially what the government is saying based on the graphs we've just seen before, and this is really what the IR35 rules are doing, is they're saying we need to take some people out of the right-hand column and put them into the left-hand column. That's what IR35 in its new guise is doing. It's saying we've got a bunch of people over there and they're paying tax in a certain way. We need to take them out of it and put them into this column, because when we put them into that column, as you can see, overall, those arrangements generate more tax for the exchequer. But then let's break that down a little bit more, shall we? In fact, let's look at the employee column and how much tax they actually pay. So as you can see, this is on 40 grand. So if an individual is paid 40 grand, how much tax do they pay? Now you can see that the employee has a little chunk on top in that sort of pea green color, which is employer's NIC. Now that's not actually paid by the employee, or is it? Economists argue that it sort of is, but it's not directly paid by them. The employee thinks that they're just paying the employee NICs and the income tax, which is the middle and the bottom part of the left-hand column. That chunk on top is actually paid over by their employer. But the IFS sort of ignore that. They say, well, it doesn't really matter who's paying the tax. The point is that an employee generates X amount of tax, whereas, as you can see, self-employed and owner managers generate less tax. But we at IPSE don't think that that can be brushed aside quite so easily. As you can see, actually, the sole trader, the column in the middle, pays a bit more tax directly than the employee does if they're on 40K. But because of the employer's NI, the total tax that the revenue receive is greater from the employee. And the owner manager doesn't pay that much less tax. Broadly speaking, you could really say all three of them are paying about the same. If you took employers NI out of it, all three groups would be paying about the same. So the problem that we have here is employers NIC, and that's why I said at the beginning that the new IR35 rules are really all about employer NICs. That's the chunk of change that the government misses out on when someone is not employed. And that is what they will get when someone is rightly or wrongly dumped onto a payroll because someone has decided that IR35 applies to their engagement. Then the government go back into getting that employer NIC. And that's the real difference. If there was no employer NI, we wouldn't be having this discussion about, there'd be no worries about IR35 because everyone would be paying pretty much about the same amount of tax. You could even tweak them all slightly, ever so slightly, but you'd be broadly paying the same amount of tax. And this is the problem that we think we need to take into account when you hear talk of equalizing tax across all different forms of working. I mean, there are some people who would say that self-employed people and owner managers and employees should all be paying the same amount of tax. Well, that's fine, but are you then saying that the sole trader should pay way more tax to make up for the employer NI element? Because then they'll be looking at the employee, and the employee will be saying, well, no, I pay income tax and I pay employee NI of 11.8%. And the self-employed person will be saying, God, I'm paying loads of tax compared to you, because they'll have forgotten about the employer NI. A lot of it does come down to perceptions, and a lot of it comes down to who is really paying that tax. As I said before, there are economists who argue that really the employee pays the employer NI. Their argument goes that essentially, if an employee thinks he's on, let's keep the math simple, £100,000, he's actually on 113,800 because he doesn't realise that he's paying that employer NIC. But the thing is that he doesn't think that. He thinks he's on 100 grand a year. And so this idea of perceptions when it comes to fairness is really important. And any tax change which is going to be accepted has to be perceived as being fair. And I think it would be perceived as being deeply unfair if you were to hoik up columns 2 and 3, if you like, the middle column and the right-hand column, to the overall same level as the first column, because they will feel like they're paying a huge amount of tax compared to the first column. Now, I think that it's probably cynically fair to say that the reason why employer NICs exists in the first place is so that people don't realise how much tax they're really paying. That's part of it. It's about disguising that. But, they are paying quite a lot of tax. The other point to make is that I'm not so sure that it is true that the employee pays all of the employer NIC, really. I mean, for example, if you were to get rid of employer NIC tomorrow, would everyone's wages go up by 13.8% overnight? I would suggest they wouldn't. I would suggest that companies would try to make some of that saving themselves. I think that companies are paying a proportion of that, and the employee is paying a proportion of it through lower wages than they might otherwise have. So I think it's a more balanced picture than that. Anyway, I'll probably waffle on about this for too long, and I hope that you're writing in comments and letting me know if I'm talking nonsense or if you think I'm talking nonsense or anything like that, because I really do want to have a robust discussion. But I'm going to rattle through these slides and try not to go over time so that we do have lots of time for a discussion about this again. And I haven't got that many slides to go, I promise you. Now, look, here, the other point that we want to make around this stuff is that the tax system should recognise risk. There are those who, like the IFS, who say that everyone should just pay the same amount of tax. But we say, no, actually, we don't agree with that. We think that people who are working for themselves, who are in business on their own account, who are striking out on their own, they are taking on a lot of risk. And there are advantages for the whole economy that they take on that risk. And therefore, they should maintain a modest tax advantage because of that, because it is good that we have lots of people working for themselves out there. We should be incentivizing that kind of behavior with a modest tax advantage. Now, I'm not going to necessarily read all of these out, but a lot of the bullet points that you can see in front of you came from a piece of research that someone called Professor Andrew Burke did. He's now at Trinity University Dublin, but he was then at the business school in Cranfield University. And it's a great piece of research. We commissioned it when we were PCG, and I think that a lot of what he found in there still holds true. And so you can see the bullet points there about they reduce entrepreneurial risk for their clients, which means they're promoting innovation and enterprise. They're liberating businesses from the limits of their internal resource. I said I wouldn't read them out, so I promise you that I won't. But essentially what he found is that freelancers enable their clients to be more innovative. He once told me a great example. He said, imagine you have a car plant and they're considering going into the electric car market, but they're not sure whether it's worth it. It's a big risk. They have to invest heavily in doing it. So they, rather than taking some of their existing staff off what they're already doing or employing some more people to look in something that they may never do, they hire some freelancers to do a bit of market research. Is there a market out there? Then they hire another set of freelancers to build a prototype. Then they hire another set of freelancers to build out the prototype into a significant fleet. And then once they've decided to go ahead, they hire lots of employees to actually set up this part of the business. So in this way, the fact that the UK has this army of freelancers available to companies and businesses, which enable them to be more innovative, to open up new parts of the market, and ultimately to create more employment. This is a good thing that freelancers do. And they do it by taking on the risk, the administrative burdens from their clients as well, because they're having to do their own tax returns and having to sort out lots of things on their own, and they're having to buy insurance to make sure that they're not, to limit damage to them and to their clients. So they do all of this, and it's a very good thing that they do it for our economy, and that is why we should have a tax advantage for our tax system should recognise the risk that freelancers take on. So with all this in mind, I wanted to quickly run past you a couple of thoughts that we've had around the tax system and how things could potentially be improved. One idea is this thing called the engager's tax. It's really more like an engager's national insurance, but doesn't really make much sense to call it that. It's not really called anything. It's really just an idea or a concept at the moment. The idea is that it would be paid by the firm that hires the self-employed people and calculated as a percentage of the total amount paid to the self-employed individual. So if a firm, let's say BP, wants to hire a self-employed person, and they're going to pay them £100, they will also pay £5 in engager's tax over to the government. This is one idea. The reason why this idea is attractive is because there's no direct charge to individual self-employed people. So that's good for us because we don't want self-employed people to have to pay more tax. We'd rather they paid less. And it apes employers' NI. So it seems more fair. If we're talking about fairness, bringing in something like employers' NI but for self-employed people sort of makes a bit of sense. The downside is that it is likely to put downward pressure on rates. So rather than if they're paying someone £100 a day and now they have to pay 5% on top of that, they might say to that person, well, from now on, we're going to pay you £95 a day. Or they would sort of balance it out between them. They might share the burden of this new thing, which means that the self-employed person will be paid a little bit less, but the tax man will be happy because they're getting more tax. We think this idea is worth exploring more, but the only thing is we are aware that we wouldn't want something introduced that would put downward pressure on self-employed people's rates. However, we have to understand one thing, that there is a lot of pressure on self-employed people at the moment from the policymakers. They are desperate to put up their taxes directly. And I think that it may be better to put it onto the hirers than onto the individuals. But one way or another, it seems likely that some tax is going to be applied somewhere. And so we need to think about where we think it should go. In an ideal world, no tax would be applied. We'd lower the taxation rate for everyone. That would be the ideal world. But we're not in an ideal world. We've just had the coronavirus, the public finances in an absolute state. And there is a lot of talk about where tax could go up in order to pay for some of the black hole that's been created. And so we think it's important to show that we can come forward with some ideas. This is one of them. It was first mentioned by Demos, and that quote you can see there is from and Demos is a think tank, by the way. And that quote that you can see there came from a report they did called Free Radicals, which is another report that we commissioned, but it was their report. This is not agreed. The engagers tax is not agreed IPSE policy. We are not saying we've 100%, this is what we believe. This is an idea that exists out there already that we think could be worth exploring a bit further. Okay, let me know what you think about the engagers tax in the questions boxes, and we'll come back round and look at those comments. The other idea that we've had at IPSE is something called the Freelancer Limited Company. We worked with EY to develop this a few years ago, and some of you might remember that we actually did a big consultation with our members on this, and we had a vote, and most of our members supported us pushing the FLC concept further. So this is agreed IPSE policy, though it was agreed a few years ago. I acknowledge that. The idea was recommended for further consideration by the Office of Tax Simplification in 2016. The idea of this is that it would be a new type of company for tax purposes. It's all about providing a safe haven, the FLC. So the idea is that IR35 is coming to get you. This is what we realized back then. The government were making moves to try to clamp everybody into basically getting everyone onto the payroll. That's what they wanted to do. They wanted to take all of what they call personal service companies and shove them onto a payroll somewhere. And we never believe that is the right option. So we said, can we create a space where freelancers can go and they can work and they can be totally transparent about it? They can say, yeah, I am a freelancer. No one's going to question that. There is no IR35. There is no, I think you're a bit of a tax dodger. Why don't you go and get on that payroll? It is fully transparent and open. In order to become an FLC, a business would have to meet certain qualifying criteria, and these would really show that you're in business on your own account. So the idea would be that you would put forward, you would say, look, I would like to be an FLC. I want to incorporate an FLC, please. And they would say, okay, well, you have to meet these conditions. And those conditions might be around, do you have a business plan? Do you have a business bank account? Do you spend money on marketing? We can talk about that. This is really just a concept at the moment. But essentially, what they'd be saying is upfront, yeah, I'm clearly not a disguised employee. That's the idea behind the FLC. Now, the pitfall of the FLC, if there is a pitfall with it, is that the government and HMRC would be very nervous about what they believe are disguised employees, so people who should be operating inside IR35, just leaping into an FLC and saying, I'm safe now, you can't get me. Which is why those qualifying criteria for them, they might set that bar a bit high. And we'd prefer it was a bit lower, because we want people to get into it easily if they wanted to. This is the idea. And finally, the FLC would be optional in our idea. No one's suggesting that this is now what, oh, you're a one director limited company, you must be an FLC. No, it's something that people could decide to be if they wanted to be. You can find more information at that link about the FLC. There's a big paper that we drafted with EY. We think that this is a good idea. What we like about this is that it provides this safe harbor, because at the moment contractors are getting attacked from all sides. So we would say, if you can achieve FLC status, then you're safe. You can carry on being a freelancer, and all those things that we listed before, why it's good that we have freelancers, that can continue. And also, we can carry on giving people inside an FLC a modest tax advantage. But there's no suggestion that they're dodging tax. They are paying their proper taxes, and there is no IR35. IR35 doesn't apply. That's gone out the window. That's the main advantage, or the main attraction, obviously, for us. So I hope that I've sort of explained that okay, and maybe you're already a bit aware of the FLC concept. Let me know what you think about the FLC and share your thoughts in the questions box. We are coming towards the end of this now, but I just wanted to mention one or two other quick things. Employment status. So because we argue that there should be a modest tax advantage for those who work for themselves, it is likely that you'll still have to police this boundary between employed and self-employed, which is kind of what IR35 rules do. And if outside of IR35, you have the same, basically the same case law looking at employment status as well. So you have the Uber cases and things where you've got individuals saying, where's my holiday pay? I'm not really self-employed. You're still going to need to police this boundary in some way or another. The problem with these rules, and particularly when it comes to, well, no, with the rules full stop, because it's the same case law that we're talking about when we're looking at should an Uber driver have holiday pay, as we are for should this IT contractor be operating inside of IR35, or should they have done the deemed calculation. Those rules are very, very hard for anyone to understand. No one understands it. And you could have two experts on IR35 status talking about the same case, and they might disagree over whether IR35 should apply or not, or whether it is employment or self-employment, or whether it's a contract of services or for services, as the legal beagles like to talk about. Now, we said in our response to the Matthew Taylor review, which was commissioned, you may remember, by Theresa May back in, I'm going to say 2017, can't quite remember now. He did a review, it was published in either 2017 or 2018. And we submitted some evidence to that. And part of our evidence was the IPSE matrix, where we said, look, we need to just stop this confusion and just decide who's employed and who's self-employed. And so we came up with a matrix, and we called it Bringing Employment Status Out of the Shadows. Some people liked our matrix, some people didn't like our matrix. It was quite controversial, it was quite radical at the time, but Matthew Taylor quite liked it, and so did Bill Dodwell, who is now the chair of the, I keep on talking about the Office of Tax Application, he's now the tax director at the OTS. So, you know, it did get quite a lot of attention, and there's a link there to looking at it. Now, we're not saying it's necessarily the be-all and end-all, but what we are saying is that the situation we have at the moment is completely untenable. No one knows when you're self-employed or not. No one knows when IR35 should apply or not. It's almost impossible for the layman to understand these things and be certain about it. So let's try and introduce a bit of certainty into this. So that's why we suggested that, and we think that needs to be looked at again as part of any review or reform of the tax system. And I think my final slide is just to plug that a lot of what I've talked about here today is going to be discussed at the Treasury Committee on Tuesday morning at 9:30. Our CEO, Derek Cribb, is going to be in front of that committee talking about this stuff. The inquiry is the tax after coronavirus inquiry. And the kind of the starting point for that inquiry is that, well, tax is going to have to go up somewhere, isn't it? So where should it go up? And that's why we've submitted written evidence to that saying, well, you shouldn't just pick on the self-employed again, like you always do, and like has been widely speculated on will happen. In fact, what we need to do is have a proper review of the tax system and work out why the tax system isn't working for self-employed people. Why are we always arguing about this? Well, the reason is because the PAYE system, which was built around employees and employers, doesn't work if you're working as self-employed. And shoving people onto that, cramming them into that box because it makes your life easier, isn't going to work. We need to have a proper think about the tax system and be prepared to consider radical ideas such as the FLC or the engagers tax. So Derek's going to be appearing there, and that link you can see there is to their page where you'll see that he's listed as appearing. And I think what will happen is there'll be a live feed on that page as well, so you can watch it live. It may well be on the Parliament TV channel as well, because often the Treasury Committee meetings are. So if you have time, 9:30 on Tuesday, I'm sure you're all busy people, but you might be interested to see that discussion. And Bill Dodwell is going to be giving evidence alongside Derek Cribb, the tax director at the OTS, and also Judith Freeman, who is an academic that we know well at IPSE. We've known her for a long time, and she's one of the people that argue that everyone should pay the same amount of tax. So there'll be perhaps a lively discussion going on there, and someone from the CBI will be there as well. Okay, that's the end of the slideshow, and here's just a little bit of places and links where if you want to stay up to date and follow us on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn. So I'm going to invite Ryan to come back in now and
Oh yeah,
see. Hi,
very good.
Ryan. See if we have had any comments or questions that we can address.
We've had loads actually, and I just want to make this point that generally, guys, at the moment, you know, any sort of feedback you have on these issues, but also things affecting you perhaps related to COVID, you know, our inbox is always open, and we do encourage you to send us your sort of stories as well. Partially because it's useful for things like, you know, we were trying to get into the press to make some of these arguments, but also to understand exactly how people are affected by some of these issues. And these kind of webinars will continue in the coming months, where we, you know, really deal with the practical issues around IR35. Generally, there's been a lot of feedback and a lot of really interesting questions actually about the particular proposals, the FLC and the engagers tax, and how they might actually work in practice. Overall, I think the feeling amongst people, and correct me if I'm wrong in the questions, but I think a lot of people are sort of saying, although the FLC could be reasonable, engagers tax does seem a bit simpler.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But then there's also there's been a little bit of concern, which we've heard before as well, that an engagers tax in particular might push down contractor rates, which we have heard elsewhere. Yeah. And
I think that's definitely a risk of it. That I think that is a very, very fair point, and I think that it all depends on the, you know, the percentage as well, doesn't it? So I think Demos, I think the slide there, so they said that when it's first introduced, you should bring it in at 2.5%, and you sort of think, well, that wouldn't be too bad. But once you've established something like that, you have to be alive to the prospect that a chancellor could come along and just put that rate up or down as they see fit. And so what if it's 15%? You know, what if it's suddenly costing a client 15% more to engage a self-employed person, a contractor, or a sole trader than it would have been beforehand? You know, that is likely to put downward pressure on those rates, isn't it? So I think that this is definitely an area of concern to us. But I do think that we do need to also recognise that there is a lot of pressure. The idea that it's either that or everything just stays as it is not right either. I mean, as it is, if you're a contractor, you're quite likely to be facing very big IR35 challenges in the next few years of your working career, with many clients just saying you're inside IR35 and I don't want to discuss it and I don't care. What we're saying is well, if rather than that, maybe it'd be better if the client just had to pay a bit of tax, pay a little bit of extra tax when they engage a contractor. That would keep the tax man happy. And yes, it might put a bit of downward pressure on the rates of contractors, but they'd still be better off than if they're shoved into IR35 unfairly. And it would be more appropriate. I mean, putting contractors on the payroll is just not an appropriate place for them to be. So that's one of the thoughts around it. Another thought I didn't mention on the engagers tax is that, and again, this is just a thought, this is not agreed IPSE policy. I think possibly there might be an argument to say that it would work better for sole traders than it would for contractors and limited companies. One of the reasons for that would be that, you know, there are all sorts of different limited companies out there. Some of them the government refers to as personal service companies, and some of them they don't. But there's no legal difference between a personal service company and any other limited company, as I said at the beginning. So how would a client know when they're paying a supplier that they have to add on the engagers tax for, and when they're not? Whereas with a sole trader, they would just know, oh, you're a sole trader, we have to pay this engagers tax. So I think that possibly what I think could be more sensible is that you apply the engagers tax where they're a sole trader, and for the limited company you introduce the FLC idea. But again, really open to thoughts and discussions on that one. So